In our next two sessions, we're going to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We've already heard this morning from Karen and others about the role sustainability standards have played in shaping markets, guiding businesses, and helping to translate global ambitions around the world into practical steps. And before we get into a broader discussion about the smart mix, it's really important for us to understand what voluntary sustainability standards are. Now, hopefully, we have a high level of understanding in this room. But to ensure that we really are all on the same page, we're really lucky to have with us an expert, maybe the expert on the topic. Dr. Axel Marx is the Deputy Director at Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies. His research includes voluntary sustainability standards and EU trade and sustainability policy. So we definitely have the right man in the room. And he's currently co-chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, which maybe needs a shortening. With over 300 academic publications in the field, we could not be in safer hands for this first introduction. So I'd like to welcome Axel to the stage, and he is going to give us some context for the rest of our morning panel.
Thank you, Emma, for the very kind invitation, and thank you to ISEAL for inviting me to give this presentation on the role, relevance, and impact of VSS, voluntary sustainability standards, in hybrid governance. And I was actually asked to give a bit of a, let's say, more academic perspective in the sense of drawing on some of the academic studies on what we know about the impact of standards, and then maybe also think a bit further on how that might fit in broader governance arrangements, and then maybe have a few reflections on the way forward, which will, of course, also will be discussed in the next panel. What I want to do is actually give a bit of a high-level overview on what do we know from academic research on the impact and relevance of voluntary sustainability standards. I want to briefly go over some studies, then actually make a bit of the case that we know already quite a bit on impact. There's also quite a number of studies conducted on that, but to really have, let's say, a larger scale impact. It's not only about impact on sustainability indicators, which I show, but it's also about increasing uptake, trying to increase scale, and there, of course, the integration of voluntary measures with policy instruments come into play, and actually show very briefly how that is currently being shaped, just as an overview on the different ways and approaches in which voluntary sustainability standards are currently integrated in different types of policy instruments. I will touch upon very briefly on trade agreements, public procurement, due diligence, we already have heard a lot about that, and also export promotion. I don't think I need to introduce voluntary sustainability standards to this audience. I just put on the slide the definition of which is in the UNFSS reports, the United Nations Forum's reports on sustainability standards. That's not the only definition. There are multiple definitions around, but it's basically trying to make sure that we have a sustainability impact, and you see some of the labels, VSS, engaged in this field on this slide. Now, about impact and relevance, I think if we look back over the last 3 decades, a lot of studies have been focusing on the effectiveness of sustainability standards. Do they really make an impact? And I think Evidentia as a platform is a great resource to get access to a lot of that evidence which has been published over the years. And I think it's also crucial to look at the evidence from a policy perspective to inform policymakers on the potential of voluntary sustainability standards. I think if we count the number of studies, there are a few hundreds. I'm not going to detail all of them, but I maybe want to focus on a few, what we call meta-reviews. And what are meta-reviews? These are studies which actually try to make an assessment on the impact of sustainability standards over a larger number of studies. And they basically want to figure out, do sustainability standards have an impact, and they do that by comparing certified producers, certified factories, with non-certified, and then see if there's a positive effect in terms of certain sustainability indicators. There's no effect or a negative effect. And when we look at these studies, they cover a wide field of topics and indicators. As we know, sustainable development is a broad concept. It can be operationalized in 3 main dimensions, but these 3 main dimensions in turn can be operationalized in many different other aspects, and of course, studies can only collect data on a limited number of aspects, and so quite a few studies focus on different aspects of the sustainability concept when analyzing the impact. A lot of these studies use existing data, they use new surveys, field research, and so on, and they try to see if there's a difference between these studies. And every time when you ask an academic researcher in the field of sustainability standards, what's now the impact, what's the evidence, the classic answer is always, it's mixed. There are studies showing a positive result, studies showing a negative, not a negative, but a neutral result. On some parameters, especially cost of production, there might be a negative impact, and so on. But how can we try to aggregate, if any, in any way possible, a bit behind these observation that the results are mixed? Some researchers try to do that, and I put on the slide a few references, and I can share the slides with every one of you if you wish, which try to look at certain elements of the sustainability sense. A much quoted study by Oya et al., which was published in World Development in 2018, looked at 43 studies, and they showed that there was, to a degree, a positive impact on prices and income for producers, but they find less evidence on the impact on wages of workers working in the fields. Traldi, in her paper on ecological indicators, looking at 45 studies focusing on the social and environmental dimensions, she tried to quantify the number of studies which showed a positive effect, the number of studies which showed no effect and a negative effect, and she, a little bit over half, indicated she found a positive effect on a number of these indicators, which were on a previous slide. Meemken, in a study mainly focusing on the socioeconomic dimensions of sustainability standards, also found a number of effects, actually quite significant positive effects on household incomes through the certification. And then a more recent study, actually published as an Evidentia report, Scalidou and Oya looked at the impact on decent work parameters, and they found on some decent work issues like wages, working conditions, occupational health and safety, worker voice and representation, freedom of association types of parameters. They find a positive impact on some, but no or less impact on some of these others. Of course, for us as researchers, what is the signal? Signals a few things. I think we still need more impact research. Some might not agree with it, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that. But it also signals that we need to think a little bit more about what are the overall conclusions we can draw from what we already have. And it's very difficult to have a black and white kind of conclusion, but if you ask me on the bulk of the evidence, I think there's evidence that there are more positive than neutral and negative impacts. So they do make a change. They do not make a change all the time in every context, maybe to the degree and expectations we had before, but there are significant transformations and impacts going on. And that has also been, I think, recognized by some other authors or multiple author papers and the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in a few other major journals, which also try to make a bit of this more general assessment that indicating that overall, I think this positive impact. As I said, not in all the cases, and if we dig into why we do not find impact in all cases, there are a lot of different explanations floating around. There are differences between VSS, which might explain this variation. There are maybe differences between the certification of certain commodities. Maybe there are variation in countries in which VSS are implemented, which provide some kind of a contextual element of the implementation. Might be related to the organization of value chains and the power relations in value chains. And also, I think what we are trying to focus on more and more in our research now, it might be related to how voluntary sustainability standards are implemented and which actors play a role in implementation in terms of fostering compliance with standards, but not only fostering compliance with standards, but also trying to have producers learn how to implement standards and produce more sustainably. So that's, I think, on the impact. Quite a bit of evidence is emerging. And I think it's important to take that into consideration. Another element we look at when we talk about impact or effectiveness of standards is the uptake of standards. Certain standards can have a significant sustainability impact on the ground, but if they are hardly adopted or used, the overall impact might be less. And that's why we look at another dimension of impact or effectiveness, which looks at the uptake. And this graph comes from a recent report published by the International Development Bank by Dolabelli and Saiteros, who look for the uptake of sustainability standards, and they do it by looking at the percentage of VSS certified area on total production area for a number of commodities, and they aggregate over a number of commodities. And they actually show that in some countries there's quite a high uptake of VSS. There are other measures to think about uptake, but that's an important element. We also see from some other studies that uptake, especially in the last couple of years, has increased very significant. And so from that perspective, it's important to understand that there's a growing importance of VSS. Now, crucial if we think about the scale of impacts, an interesting area of looking at is a trade and how VSS facilitate trade, especially in sustainable products, over a number of years. And I'm running short of time, so I will go a bit quicker on certain elements. But the main takeaway here is that over the last couple of years, we have quite a number of very extensive studies focusing on the trade impacts of voluntary sustainability standards. And while earlier studies were signaling that VSS might be a barrier to trade because producers cannot get certified due to cost, more and more recent studies show that once producers, especially in low-income and developing countries, are certified, they actually have a higher degree of produce they can trade. And what this graph shows is that on the y-axis, it's the importer's economic level on a country. And on the x-axis are the different types of exporters categorized in the, let's say, level of economic development of the country. And on the most left side, what you see is that you actually have a very significant trade effect from low-income producers to high-income countries once they get certified. And what it signals in terms of effects is that for each % more certified of a production area, you increase trade with 20%. And that's actually not only in this study, which is shown, but there are several other studies which show similar effects. The effect decreases when the income level of countries in which producers operate increases, but it's very strong, important effect. And these effects are generated when there's a scale effect of the adoption of voluntary standards. Then if the clicker wants to work, which it does not. There we go. Then it becomes, of course, important to think about how to scale up the take-up of voluntary sustainability. And there I come to the second part, which is actually about the crucial role governments or international actors play in scaling up the voluntary sustainability standards. And what that we mean is that if you integrate voluntary sustainability standards in public policy instruments, the incentives for adoption increase. And there's a lot to be said about these things, but I only have a couple of minutes left. So I will go very quickly because I'm very well aware of time. But just to highlight a few important developments in that area. First of all, we see an increasing integration of voluntary sustainability standards and free trade agreements. Initially, that was actually just promotional language that partners to a trade agreement commit to promote sustainability standards. In more recent developments, we see, especially with the EFTA Indonesia FTA, that sustainability standards can be a measure to differentiate tariffs between sustainable and non-sustainable products. There might be a similar mechanism, but we need to see at the final documents of the just concluded EU-Indonesia CEPA agreement, but there might also be an important element that VSS can be a trade tariff differential. Second, increasing integration of sustainability standards and sustainable public procurement. And that's also here, especially in the EU, quite strongly pushed by the Commission to integrate or look at sustainability standards when acting as a business. I'm not going to go into due diligence. There's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of similarities. The bottom line there is that sustainability standards are an important tool for business if they want to engage and comply with the due diligence measures, and that holds across a broad level of due diligence measures. And the bottom line here is that basically the due diligence mechanisms, and the slide shows actually what the OECD proposes in terms of due diligence process a company needs to go through, aligns very much to the same types of processes companies go to when complying with sustainability standards. So there's actually quite a strong overlap. Export promotion, just to highlight that a lot of not only countries here, but also developing countries are integrating sustainability standards in their policies, and we already heard that in the previous panel. Very quickly as a conclusion, because I need to wrap up, and I actually can be very short because we already talked a lot about credibility in the previous panel, but I think main takeaway is that voluntary sustainability standards from a sustainability governance perspective are an important instrument. We need to find ways to scale them up and engage with them, but we need to be very well aware that there are many differences between voluntary sustainability standards. They are not equal. There are many different variations. ISEAL has these credibility principles, which we delved into very deeply last panel, but they are crucial to understand, to see for policymakers to work with which sustainability standards when they integrated in policy instruments. And that's a very, I think, important element which we will take throughout this day to discuss. And I think for credibility standards, there's a very important element to be taken into account when deciding which and how sustainability standards are integrated in policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel. And I think a good reminder of how sustainability systems can play an important role for both policy making and implementation. I'm just going to put this down a bit. And also business practices. And in this current context, that's maybe more important than ever. With European policies being reshaped and ESG under pressure in some regions, but gaining ground in others, the question of how to get this balance of different components right is more urgent than ever. And so our next panel is going to help us consider the opportunities and challenges with the smart mix. So I'd like to invite Vidya Rangan up. She will be our moderator for today and is the Director of Policy and Engagement at ISEAL. And joining her on her panel, please come up, we have Monica Rubiolo, who's the Head of Trade and Promotion at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, Xavier Gine, the Lead Economist at the World Bank, Solomon Boateng, Executive Secretary at Kwapa Cocoa Farmers Union, and himself a cocoa farmer, Christine Moser-Privek, Head of Green Button Secretariat and the team lead in the social economic transformation of textile supply chains at GIZ, and Jeff Milder, Director of the Accountability Framework Initiative at the Rainforest Alliance. Vidya, over to you.
Thank you, Emma, and this is now working. Good afternoon, everyone. We were here all morning, and it's now past noon. We have a very interesting conversation ahead of us. To continue with the dance theme from the morning, we've heard it takes two to tango. This panel is really going to go into what that involves. What does it really mean when we say we want a smart mix to work well? What are the components? What are the ingredients? What are the challenges and what are the barriers? And in order to do that, we have a very wide range of perspectives that we want to bring in, perspectives from practice, perspectives from conceptual thinking, perspectives from government, also from tools that are indeed set up to operate as smart mix approaches. But before we go into all of that, I'm very aware we haven't brought in the audience yet this morning. So we're going to run a bit of a poll. If my colleagues can bring that QR code up, I would invite all of you to use your mobile devices, which no doubt everyone has at hand, and quickly enter that poll. Great. Can we bring the question up? Or is that something that... Okay, so the question we want everyone to engage with is, on a scale from 1 to 5, rate your response to the statement. VSS will adopt a very significant role in driving sustainability in the next 5 years, even more so than in the past, given current political and economic uncertainties. Let's give people 30 seconds. Okay, I'm very glad to see it's not all around 3, which is a very good sign and a big risk when you put a rating scale from 1 to 5, that everyone's going to stick to 3. All right. Okay, well, thank you for participating. So it looks like people do still believe that voluntary standards will have an important role to play, and maybe a little bit of what we'll explore in this panel is why that's going to be the case, given current political, economic, and policy uncertainties. So thank you all very much. Let me start the panel discussion with you, Xavier. So Xavier, your team is currently leading the finish up of this year's World Bank's World Development Report 2025, which focuses on standards in development. And one of the important arguments that I think that report will make is really, what does it mean when we say there is role for standard setting by governments and standard setting in the voluntary space? So we are really talking conceptually about whether this is going to be a happy marriage, right, of voluntary and mandatory standard setting. Tell us a little bit more about that argument and why you think having the space for both mandatory and voluntary standards is a good idea.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. So what I'll say is, I mean, first, regulation should, focus on the areas that, consumers and society care about. And then, the way we think about this smart mix is, let regulation sort of cover broad principles, and then use standards for the how, right? To iron out the technical details. And so, this is gonna help to make regulations more more adaptable. You can, I mean, it's very hard to change regulations. It's a lot easier to change the standards in which regulations are referenced to. And so, so it's going to help, again, by leaving all the details to the standards, then the voluntary standards, you can then, make it more adaptable, make it more innovation friendly, and so on. And just to, now, when setting these voluntary standards, you need to have quality infrastructure in place to make it to comply with the standards, right? I think this relates to this credibility word that is now being used. And one example that sort of relates to that, and where governments, actually this is the case in India, about the adoption of LEDs. So instead of banning basically incandescent bulbs, what they did is actually used incentives through procurement so that firms could basically innovate and produce LEDs so that, because, again, government contracts would only buy LED firms, and so LED bulbs, and so that developed standards from the industry. And then, also they imposed certification for LEDs, to guide, consumer choices. And so, but anyway, this was, an effort to, again, not push regulation onto, but rather, use incentives to drive innovation and drive sustainability. Then I'll stop here.
Thank you. Monica, I'm going to turn to you. The Swiss government has been walking the talk in implementing a smart mix approach, recognizing and leveraging the use of voluntary standards, but also coming in with the regulatory basis. Tell us a little bit about why this is an important strategy that you've adopted, and maybe why it's important in the trade dimension as well. Why is it important to get the space for both voluntary and mandatory action?
Okay, I would say that we have come a long way. So we started many years ago to think around sustainability. And when we approved the last and the current foreign economic policy, we have put sustainability as one of the three key pillars. So we are talking about embedding sustainability into the policy space. But then I have to say it's nothing that just happens yesterday. So the right policy mix or the smart mix is something that takes a lot of time. Xavier was asking me in the earlier in the morning, so you start now to move around sustainability, and I have to say no. It has been really a long time ago that we managed to introduce and to support voluntary sustainability standards in Switzerland. I was just 5 years ago celebrating the 25th anniversary of Max Havelaar Fair Trade in Switzerland. This started as a seed financing from the Swiss government. So this just shows how long the journey has gone. Now, what we have done over the past year is really to try to balance the different elements. We believe that regulation has to take a subsidiary role. So we believe also in market instruments, and voluntary sustainability standards are market instruments. So we work together with economic operators, and this through different channels. I would say that one thing is the direct support to the standards, which used to be the past, so that was the case Max Havelaar Fair Trade I was mentioning, but then we moved to a more systemic approach, collaborating directly with ISEAL and trying to support the whole community, the whole family of standards through different channels, supporting innovation. We do finance an innovation fund that tries to look into all the challenges the standards have about interoperability, about credibility, about ensuring evidence on impact. We also support evidentia, and I think that Axel was mentioning that point, the issue of developing the necessary evidence to support the case for voluntary sustainability standards is for us very important. But I would say also to look at the evidence for regulation and the impact on regulation. And we have very funny discussions 6 months ago about to what extent the recent developments in regulation and really looked at the previous case to EUDR, which is the tropical timber regulation. And we found very little evidence on that. So I would say that evidence is necessary on the regulatory space as well as on the voluntary space. And the last point is also we try to support the different tools, so also working with some important partners in the trade space to navigate this complex world of voluntary sustainability standards versus regulations. We collaborate with ITC on the standard maps, which provides really the necessary information for consumers and for operators on the standards. And I think this is also very important. And the last point is we made a move, as it was quoted, to make the direct link to standards in a recent manner through, in the case of the agreement, the free trade agreement with Indonesia, where we specifically referred to the standards. And I think it was a very bold move. It required a lot of work internally. I have the chance to have the colleague of mine that was sitting at that time in Bern and was part of the negotiating team on the Indonesia agreement. And it was really a journey. But it helped us very much to look into how to reference the standards, how to measure the impact of the standards, and how to empower the operators to use them. So it's really a journey, I would say.
Thanks, Monica. And that's very interesting to hear, because the really important point you make is we're not starting from scratch here. There are already examples around what operationalizing the smart mix could look like. Christine, I want to bring you in now. Tell us a little bit about Green Button, why Green Button was set up, and why you think it's a very good example of a smart mix approach.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good morning, everyone. I think before I do that, I should explain a bit what the Green Button is. And you have to bear with me for a moment, because it is a little bit of a smart mix on its own in a micro level. So the Green Button is the government-run certification label for sustainable textiles in Germany. It is government-run because it has been launched and is commissioned by the BMZ, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's been launched in 2019. And the Green Button is unique because it has two pillars, and one is more important than the other. At its core, pillar one is in a full-fledged human rights environmental due diligence standard that is, and that's different to most of the VSS that we talk about here today, that is assessed by third parties at the brands and retailers headquarters here in Germany and Europe. And then there's a second pillar, because we wanted to bring also the product sustainability in. It's a product-related criteria for sustainability that we don't assess in the supply chain, but we here recognized existing VSS in the textile sector through a meta-label approach. And then when we have both, and human rights, environmental due diligence assessment certification at the brands retailers level, plus product certification by existing VSS, then the Green Button product, the product can be labeled with the Green Button. So why is that sort of a good example for a smart mix? Because in 2019, I mean, it's hard to imagine sometimes, but 6 years back, we didn't have supply chain legislation yet in Germany or in Europe. In fact, there was still a heated debate whether there should be legislation and mandatory regulation. And the Green Button was intentionally set up in the textile sector to prove, yes, you can assess human rights, environmental due diligence in European companies or in brands and retailers, buying companies, and you can assess it, and it's also possible to implement because we face still a lot of doubts about whether HREDD is really doable and so on, and more than 100 certified companies, small and big, B2B, B2C, have shown that it is possible. So in a way, that's a good example for a smart mix. And then I think now that we're here and now that we have the Supply Chain Act in Germany, The other smart mix element that is important is we have not only prepared companies to be able to show compliance with the regulation, but we're also actually really been instrumental in helping the competent authority that is monitoring implementation, the BAFA, to sort of train their staff on how we do assessments, but also exchange regularly on how assessment of due diligence can be done also by competent authorities. Also, we have been working a lot in the public procurement sector to introduce HRD requirements there for public procurers, and we're happy to talk more about that. And of course, given current omnibus debates, I think it is important that there is a voluntary scheme on HRD in the textile sector that is still there, ambitious, and will always stay more ambitious, and have to stay more ambitious than mandatory regulation.
Thanks so much, Christine. Solomon, over to you. You represent Kwapa Cocoa, one of Ghana's largest farmers' cooperatives. There is a tendency in this debate to see producers as receivers of regulation, receivers of voluntary sort of schemes. But Kwapa has a very long history of working with fair trade. Tell us a little bit, from a producer's standpoint, where do you see the value for mandatory rules coming in? And where do you see the role for voluntary action and support from schemes?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So, as we just said, everything ends on us. I remember when the UDR was announced, we were told that it's for companies. But if you look at the regulation, everything ends on producers, because when we don't comply, they cannot comply. I will respond by looking at the two, responding two folds. The first one has to do with the value in the mandatory regulation. We have been implementing voluntary sustainability for a very long time. What we have seen recently is that, I think this is something that previous speakers just mentioned, where we see the mandatory obligation creating that level playing field for everybody. You see in the past, commercial partners, some of them only interested in just buying and going. They just pay you because it's voluntary. Nobody is obliged to implement a sustainable program. But the mandatory is making it now a force. So we see commercial partners now getting interested in sustainable programs. You don't see us chasing them more, but they coming to us to implement some of the programs. So that is one value that we have seen, that because a lot are now getting involved, we will see the rare impact, the bigger impact than where selected few were implementing sustainability programs. Another thing we have also noticed is the additional investment. Now, it's not just, even those who are doing the voluntary initiative with us, now committing additional income or additional funds for implementation of sustainability programs. For example, the EUD are coming. They know that when they buy the beans from you, they pay fair trade premium and all that. But they are now giving additional investment to make sure that you comply. Because if you don't comply, they will not also be compliant. That is one thing that we have also seen. And then incorporation. We have seen that all the certification schemes, RA, Fair Trade, they are doing well by the moment the EUDR announcement was made, they incorporated the regulations into the standards. To us, it was very good because you see the regulation to be, yes, regulation, and sometimes we all try to avoid regulation because we think it's punitive. But once they put it, they incorporate it, what it means is that we are also supposed to incorporate it in our operations. So it makes the implementation easier because it is something that we have started doing, and now it is mandatory. So when you incorporate it into your system, it becomes simple in terms of the implementation. And then one thing the certification schemes are also doing is their reward. If you look at the EUDR is punitive. If you don't comply, we punish you. But the schemes are now turning it that comply and get reward for it. So it tunes our minds from being punitive to being a reward. So that is one important thing that we have also noticed. And then I was telling Rev from Ari that when the EUDR was announced, we were not so panicking. Why? Because 5 years, 6 years ago, we started most of these things with Ari and fair trade. The only thing that changed is the timing of implementation, because we were doing it gradual. But the EUDR is saying, no, shorter time to implement. So we needed more investment to do it. But it didn't actually put so much pressure on us. It was not entirely innovative, new, because it's something that we were doing. So that is how the value being everybody is now going to implement. And the good thing is that certification schemes, IRA and fair trade, have incorporated the UD and all the CS3GD, everything into the standard. So it makes it a bit easier for we producers to implement, whilst in addition to that, there is a reward for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solomon. Really interesting insights there on the sort of value both from mandatory and voluntary approaches. Jeff, I want to come to you as we bring this first round to a close. You work directly with companies, supporting them advance on human rights, on deforestation and conservation goals. Is a smart mix a good thing from a company perspective? Tell us about what you're hearing from companies about why they want to continue to work with voluntary schemes, even though a lot of what we're seeing standards do is starting to become mandatory now.
Thanks for the question, Vidya. Quite challenging to channel a single company perspective, but I'll address that from the standpoint of our work on the accountability framework. For those who might not be familiar, this is a global cross-commodity roadmap to address deforestation, conversion, and human rights issues in the agriculture and forestry supply chains. So it's not a certification per se, but it's a voluntary instrument. It's based on broad civil society consensus, as well as foundations in international human rights law and global environmental goals. So it's been applied by hundreds of companies and also used to inform the development of various other voluntary instruments, monitoring tools, as well as reporting and accountability systems. So I'll speak from that basis. And what we see that companies are looking for is that, first and foremost, they want clarity and consistency in what's being asked of them, as Heidi alluded to earlier. This is really number one. They're also looking for efficiency in how they implement and report on their sustainability efforts. And they want access to context-specific tools and solutions that work for their particular supply chains. So with these company priorities in mind, I like lists, so I'm going to highlight 5 ways in which I see that companies are finding value in the voluntary side of the smart mix. The first is that voluntary tools have often been available sooner than regulation, and so they provide provisional rules and norms, as well as the opportunity for market recognition, and both of those are really crucial for encouraging and incentivizing early action. The second is that instruments such as ours, the accountability framework, also the UN guiding principles, OECD guidelines, that take a global and cross-commodity approach, do help overcome one of the limitations of regulation, which is put forward by nation states or by blocs such as the EU, which have finite jurisdiction. And we see that in many cases, companies really do want to be able to take a global, integrated, cross-commodity approach to how they set goals, how they design systems, how they report progress. And so that can be an important role of voluntary instruments. Third, and this was, I think, mentioned already earlier, voluntary instruments can provide an important level of detail and tools to guide situational business decisions. For instance, in the context of due diligence-based laws such as CSDDD, these laws provide space for companies to balance competing factors. For instance, whether they should retain a supplier with non-compliance and work with them to drive improvement, or whether they should discontinue the business relationship. Companies we find are looking for more specific guidelines and tools to make decisions such as those, as well as to address particular commodity and geographic contexts. Fourth, we see companies really valuing voluntary tools and initiatives as a space for innovation, both on the ground and in supply chains. I think a good example of this is the burgeoning space of landscape initiatives, where companies recognize that there's a whole category of challenges that they're not equipped to solve totally on their own. And so they want spaces where they can collaborate in structured or semi-structured ways to address these more systemic issues like deforestation or land tenure or child labor. And then finally, in the present era of policy rollbacks, voluntary instruments can provide a North Star of clarity and predictability that allow companies to stay the course and continue to pursue progress, even when the external environment is extremely dynamic. And we see companies using the accountability framework and others such as SBTI in this way.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Great five points from you in terms of the role that voluntary schemes can continue to play. I'm going to shift gears now to move us into the next part of the panel, which is really talking about some challenges. I think it would be naive to think it's all hunky-dory and smart mixes operate perfectly, but they don't. But as I do that, I want to start encouraging participants in the audience to think of questions, because after we do this round, we're going to come straight to you all for your thoughts and views. So please do think about questions or comments you may have for the panel. Solomon, I'm going to start the second round with you. You spoke about how when regulation like the EUDR came in, it wasn't a shock because a lot of what it asked for was already in the works in terms of implementation. But what type of support do producers need when new regulations like the EUDR or CSDDD come in? Do you think the support is coming through, and what gaps do you think need to be filled in order to ensure that producers are well supported to take advantage and not be disadvantaged from these new laws?
Okay, thank you. So let me put it in this perspective. If you look at Kuyapa Cocoa, for example, we have over 100,000 cocoa farmers, which is very big. Let's assume that each farmer has just 2 plots, just 2 farms. We are talking about over 200,000 plots. There is this question that I asked that, okay, so per the regulation, we are supposed to send data on farms that are more than 4 hectares or so. So less, you are supposed to just send coordinates if it's less than 4. So the question that I ask is, how do you know that this plot is 4 hectares or more if you don't map it? So essentially, we are supposed to map everything. But in sharing the data, we'll give you what you want. So imagine the short period for us to implement this. We needed support from partners. And that is why I mentioned that with RA and Fair Trade is something that it helped us, because something that we were doing. It's only just to fasten it. So one support that I always ask is that it's not about you, commercial partner, building a system, and then we feeding the system with data, and the data sits with you. We are encouraging build and own. So we should have the systems in place. We will get the data. We will use the system to do the analysis and then share the data with you. And these are some of the platforms that other companies are helping us to do, so that we can rather share the data. One other thing that we have also seen, where I also say Fair Trade and area are also doing very well. It is sometimes costly to build this system. So alongside, they have also created a system where you can do all the analysis there. You can have access to the report, and we can also share. What is happening is that it puts us, the producers, at a certain level where we become more attractive to market as well. Because for now, some companies are doing, let me say, is it cut and run kind of? They look at who can comply, and then they come to you. So they pick and choose. So once there's a system like this in place, what it means is that all of us will have the opportunity to actually assess it. And so all of us will comply and open that market opportunity for all of us. Another thing that I want to talk about it is whether, I think some experts have described it as producer blindness. Whether when some of these systems, when some of the regulations are being put forward, we actually consider the producers, the impact on producers. As I said, it is not by the companies that are going to comply, because the companies don't own farms. They will come to producers, so we are supposed to comply. But do you take into consideration the impact on us? Because as I just mentioned, imagine Kwapa Cocoa having over 200,000 plots. The question is, can Kwapa Cocoa comply? We are able to produce not less than 60,000 tons of cocoa every year. Over 60% of it ends up in EU. So if you don't comply, 60% is cut. What happens to us? What happens to EU market? And that's why some experts are advising that if you are not careful, there will be that kind of supply chain shift. We need the cocoa in Europe. So the support comes to one, capacity building. We are looking at building systems for us. And then commercial partners not doing more of the pick and choose. We support producers. We support us to comply. I think that is because, as I earlier said, voluntary, only few people were doing the voluntary because it is voluntary. Now it is mandatory. It is mandatory to make sure that once there's a level playing field, we'll be able to measure real impact than what it used to be. So we should avoid the cut and paste so that we can all work together. This is what I can see. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you so much. Monica, I want to come to you. You alluded in your opening remarks to a wide range of ways in which the smart mix has been integrated into policy instruments by the Swiss government in the field of trade, but also in sort of regulatory direction. What challenges have you seen in operationalizing the smart mix, both in terms of getting regulation right, but also where voluntary standards need to step up?
Many of the challenges have been mentioned already in one way or another in the discussions. One big challenge is to understand the specific context conditions. So when we develop a regulation or when we support also a voluntary standard in a particular country context, in a particular crop, you have completely different story talking about cocoa or if it is about coffee. So this is really one specific challenge. The second one is the need for collaboration, but true collaboration. And I think the concept of landscape has been mentioned, and this is the way also how the Swiss government intends to support collaboration between different stakeholders working in a similar space. So this is a way how we try to support that not only the economic operators do play a role, but also the local authorities that are the ones in the position to ensure the enforcement of regulations. Because the standards and also the international regulations do have to rely at the end on the local enforcement. And this is something that has been really very much neglected all the previous time. The third point is really the collaboration and fostering collaboration when you know from the beginning that there are different viewpoints. And I think that one way we try to do that and to support that is kind of using the concepts of the multi-stakeholder approaches that ISEAL defends and represents also in a particular Swiss context. We have launched over the past years 2 multi-stakeholder initiatives, one in the cocoa, one in the coffee sector, that really try to bring the different opinions from the private sector, the civil society, the research organizations, and the government. And the reason for doing that is perhaps a bit of the particular Swiss context consensus-oriented type. So I try to explain this a little bit on a cultural basis. But there have been really very interesting, challenging discussions also within these multi-stakeholder platforms to try to marry the views of the big players that do have the capacity to operate in different countries and do have the capacity to implement regulations, and the smaller players in Switzerland as well as in origin countries. There are really not much differences. If I talk to an SME that had perhaps one person that is doing sustainability and compliance and procurement at the same time, yeah? And I think that for us is, I think it's also a challenge is to bring the two views. It's not only about production, but we also have to work on the consumer side. We have been very lucky, I would say, in Switzerland to work together with the retailers in order to ensure the mainstreaming of sustainability on the shelves of the Swiss supermarkets. So you don't have to go to a specific shop to look for sustainable produces, but you can go just to mainstream supermarkets. And this has really enforced a little bit the reflex on the consumers to request for sustainability, to ask for sustainability. And this leads me to the last challenge I see, and it has been also mentioned. I think we need to move from seeing sustainability as a nice to have add-on to really a competitive edge for the companies. So it has to be one of the arguments for the companies to be part of the game. And if we do that, then we will manage to really mainstream sustainability.
Thanks, Monica. Christine, you explained green button. It sounds interesting, but also complicated. I'm sure there's been quite a few challenges to iron through and work through. And when you and I spoke, you were talking about how a lot of what hinges on the success of green button should really come down to the strength of the systems in terms of assurance or third-party support that comes in. Tell us a little bit about the challenges that green button has faced and how you've worked through them, and the role that third-party voluntary schemes can play in that.
Sure. So, well, with HREDD, like I said, in 2019, not yet regulated on a mandatory level. Obviously, building a system in which we had to first train auditors, obviously, to be a credible scheme, to make sure that it's implemented and enforced, in a credible and robust way. And that has been a challenge in itself, because most VSS at that point in time that we worked with were not set up to audit due diligence. Hence, auditors were not set up to audit due diligence. So we did invest a lot in building that competence in the system, to train them, to monitor them, to ensure continuous improvement through, we call it the Holy Trinity of training them, having an integrity program that we run together with ASI, and then also have accreditation in the system. That has taken a while, obviously, for us, also learning from a first round of a pilot that we drafted and so on. And then regulation came in, and we're talking about smart mix here, right? Which is fantastic. This has been the intent all the way, right, of the green button, to show it's possible and to stimulate that regulation going forward. And it has helped normalizing HREDD in the sector. But it obviously also created for us the need to adapt, because consistency is a demand that companies rightly ask for. And right now, obviously, we're in a tricky situation with regulation being a moving target. Adapting to this and having the insecurity also on the company side is a challenge right now, being entangled so deeply into a smart mix, like in our case. But then you were also referring to our second pillar, where we recognize VSS for the product sustainability. And there, one challenge, and this has been also referenced in the last panels, obviously the fragmentation, especially in the textile sector. We have a lot of systems that are really vastly different in many regards in terms of content, what they focus on, whatnot, but also in terms of the assurance. systems behind them, how credible they are, and how and so on. Being a government-run system, we had to ensure that we had high standards of credibility, but then also social and ecological criteria. And it was quite an endeavor sorting through and discussing that with the different VSS and coming to a common denominator that we can work on. And I think so beyond the green button, we talk about the role of VSS in government policy, and I'm sure you can speak a lot to this. I think it does require a lot of literacy on standards and certifications and how they work to make sure that you bring in VSS in the policy mix in an effective way, right? To make sure that you're actually not driving unintended negative effects by, let's say, having the bar of what is good, credible VSS too low, for example. And I think green claims, for example, is a regulatory endeavor that I personally, and I think also I can speak for the Green Button MBMs, that we support. And I think it's great in that debate, but it comes with its own perks when we talk about HREDD. I think there are certain elements of that are actually difficult for us as a scheme. And I think, Heidi, if I may reference you, I've seen you speak, I think, at the beginning of the year. And with HREDD, we want the sector to move forward, or actually the industry to move forward, accepting that it's okay to not be okay. That's something you've said, Heidi, and I think it's been really powerful. This is what human rights due diligence, environmental due diligence is about, right? We start from what's not okay and we improve it. It's a continuous improvement. Coming from the VSPS perspective, credibility, especially from consumers, is something where the question I get a lot is, can you guarantee there's no child labor in here? Well, that does contradict a bit what the HREDD journey is about. We want to prevent child labor, but when it's there, we don't want to exclude an economic operator. We want to start working exactly there to make sure that there is remediation. And we want to start working exactly there to make sure this is prevented in the future. And I think we need to have also on the policy level a debate of what incentives we're setting with different policy files that we bring forward. Sorry, this has been complex, but I really wanted to make that point.
No, that was great. Thank you. Maybe quick thoughts from Jeff and Xavier before we move to the floor. Jeff, what is the best enabling environment that we can give to companies right now to incentivize more investment and action?
Another not easy question. I'm going to use my time on that one to talk about the importance of alignment and what that means in the smart mix. So I think integral to the smart mix is that regulatory instruments, voluntary instruments, and other initiatives such as partnerships are all well aligned with one another. And so I want to unpack what that means. So first, there needs to be strategic alignment. And this means that all the different measures in the smart mix are calling for basically the same sets of actions, or at least complementary sets of actions, both on the ground and with regard to business practices. Of course, the different measures can drive these actions in different ways through mandatory requirements, through incentives, tools, investments, and so forth. That's what makes them complementary. But in order to get this synergy, they should all be reinforcing the same sets of actual changes in how business is done. A good example of this is the central role that deforestation avoidance plays in the fulfillment of corporate goals on climate and nature. So even though these instruments and their mandates come from different places and they're different in their nature, they both necessitate companies basically doing the same sets of things, engaging with their suppliers, taking preventive measures in sourcing areas to prevent deforestation and conversion, and then also at the same time improving productivity and resilience of existing cultivated and degraded lands. So there's good strategic alignment in that case. A contrary example, I think, and I'll put my finger on maybe a tension that is kind of evident in this policy space, is the tension between strict compliance-based rules such as EUDR that in some cases would compel companies to exclude suppliers and producers from their supply chains versus due diligence-based approaches, as Christine was just explaining, really taking much more of an engage and improve approach. And there's undeniably a tension there when it comes to alignment of how these manifest on the ground. The second form of alignment I think is key in the smart mix is operational alignment, which means that companies are able to take an integrated approach to fulfill all the different requirements and mandates basically under a single integrated management system. And this means working to align requirements and expectations around supply chain due diligence and its component elements, such as risk assessment, traceability, monitoring, and remedy. And ideally, these are considered with respect to both environmental and human rights topics, because ultimately these both land in the same origins and they implicate the same sets of business decisions. And then the third is technical and administrative alignment. And this means that as much as possible, we're using the same definitions, we have the same monitoring parameters, the same data requirements, and that we're looking for ways to avoid duplication of costly functions like auditing and risk assessments. So these are key elements of alignment. They also carry through to the realm of disclosure. So if we have agreement on what this definition of success looks like, then we're able to develop more unified metrics, and this can reduce the reporting burden while also strengthening accountability. What this means fundamentally is that companies know what's expected of them. They're evaluated in these ways on a consistent basis, and when they do achieve these results, they're able to be recognized for that and gain business benefits from doing so.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a really nice framework for the 3 levels of alignment that need to be achieved. And Xavier, maybe to come to you, and the last thought before I open up to the floor. Under what circumstances do you think mandatory standards are needed, and when do you think it can be left to market forces? This is some of the recommendations you're going to be writing in your report, so give us a sneak preview.
Yeah, so basically, standards should be voluntary and left to the industry, left to the private sector. If there's a market demand, that's where the expertise resides, and so they should do as much as possible. Governments should basically only intervene mainly as conveners when there's too many standards to harmonize, when there's no standards to come up with a standard, again, in conjunction with industry. And also governments can intervene to sort of support the adoption of standards, especially when, for exports and others. Now, mandatory standards, regulations are needed again when there's there's public risks involved, right? Safety and so on and so forth. But again, how you set these standards, how you set regulations is critical, because you have to take into account the compliance capacity of countries that might be very different, right? And so what we're proposing is sort of a tiered approach, where sort of the top tier is the international standard, thanks to TBT and so on, and WTO agreements. They should, countries should use the international standard as much as possible. But when that's not, when that might lead to exclusion, again, we're talking about regulations here. We're talking about, any firm that wants to sell to a particular country has to comply with this, right? And so, when that might lead to exclusion or might lead to compliance costs that are too high, then you need to basically, settle on a standard that's less stringent. And again, we're not advocating for every country to adapt to local conditions, because that would lead to a proliferation of standard, many different regulations. But basically, have a few tiers that all use the same definitions and terms as the international standard. But basically, there's mutual recognition that if you meet, a higher standard, then you automatically comply with lower standards. And again, countries should not do these individually, but actually they could try to use regional approaches and, the regional organization, so that they all comply with sort of the same standard. That might also imply that they can use they can pool resources for the quality infrastructure, right? So we don't, doesn't make sense for all the countries to have, each country to have a metrology institute, an accreditation institute, and so on. They could actually pool resources regionally, right? I mean, it's interesting to hear Matthias talk about how the EU doesn't work. I mean, we always have the EU as an example that that's integrated. It's a common market, and so if the EU doesn't work, well, then let's talk about where other countries in the world might work. And I'll just end up with so this is what countries can do for national regulations or local regulations. Sometimes, of course, countries, if they want to, boost exports, they want to lead an export led growth strategies. They have to comply with standards that are set by buyers, and they're, not to be controversial, but so Solomon was mentioning EUDR. That's very one-sided, right? I mean, it's so the EU determining what. Now, again, there's good reasons for EUDR, right? We all care about the environment, and we don't want deforestation, but compliance costs are huge, right? And so what we're advocating is to have for developing countries especially to have a seat at the table when these standards are designed, right? And this is important. Because again, they can air grievances, they can air, how costly compliance might be, and also, sort of shape how the conformity assessment can be done for these sort of international standards, right? And so we think that's important, and and that's why participation in these international forums is critical. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Room. We have a good 15 minutes for thoughts, comments, and questions. Please raise your hand. Please keep it brief so that we can bring in as many voices as possible. I think we have some floating microphones with my colleagues. So, Alan, if we can come to the lady in the front here, please. Thank you. Please be brief. Thank you.
I'll be brief. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mirona Bengescu from JDE Peats. We are one of the leaders in coffee and tea. And checking my notes, we heard today about how voluntary schemes are often more flexible, provide commodity-specific solutions, and earlier in the game, while mandatory frameworks like the EUDR set a broader direction. So, given this approach, I would be interested to learn your thoughts and your insights on how can we better integrate or formally recognize voluntary sustainability schemes within mandatory regulation, so we avoid duplication, and especially for those who are already involved in sustainability efforts and work. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a few, and then I'll bring them to the panel. I think the gentleman behind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Sergio Ugarte, Director of SECO Consult in the Netherlands and leader of several Horizon projects in sustainability. First, I'm very pleased that co-regulation and hybrid regulation in combination with ISEAL principles have become the framework of all discussions for going forward. I have a question that it is for Monica Rubiolo and Xavier Gine. It is if in your discussions you have come up already with minimum sustainability criteria or principles that are needed to be enforced in the three pillars of environment, social, and economic. If you have come up to this set of minimum sustainability criteria, and which ones of those have found the most resistance from stakeholders that you have consulted. And later it will be very interesting to know the opinion on your responses from other panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take two more in the front here, I think Axel and then Heidi, and then I'll bring them to the panel.
Thank you very much. So we heard on the panel quite a bit on the regulatory fragmentation and different voluntary, mandatory, and so on. And Jeff pointed to the very important aspect of alignment. My question is to Jeff and also the other panel members. How should we think about the alignment and who should take the lead in this?
elephant in the room. Sure. Heidi.
I think Solomon made a very important point when he said that when, for instance, and I think you were referring to the EUDR, that the producer countries and maybe the different producers were not much heard when it was put in place. However, there is this Article 30, which sort of mandates the European Commission to establish a framework of partnerships with those countries to help them implement. And now, of course, unfortunately, I can see that development funds are being cut, and the Commission has been extremely reluctant to look at the wording in Article 30 EUDR, which says the Commission shall do this. It's not nice to have. It's essential for the implementation. But what to do at this moment, I think it would be a drastic mistake now to sort of say that, we will postpone another year, 2 or 3, I don't know, and we will make the obligations easier. So, because that opens again the Pandora's box and creates more uncertainty. But what are the sort of measures that are needed right now? But I do have to say that this kind of roundtables with different stakeholders coming together, like the Cocoa Coalition, have been at least one attempt to sort of find ways to implementation. So I don't know, maybe Solomon, maybe someone else wants to comment this.
Thanks, Heidi. Okay, we have a few interesting questions here. The one from JD Peets, are there good examples of where voluntary standards are already recognized in mandatory regulations? All through the morning we've heard some examples, but would anyone like to point to a few? Monica and then maybe Jeff?
Yes, I think that the good example is the one that I was mentioning with the agreement on the free trade agreement between Switzerland and Indonesia, because we there recognized the role of the standards directly. And I think this kind of links to the issue of the challenges of the standards too, because one of the main points of discussions we had at that time is how would we operationalize concretely the standards recognition at the borders. So we are talking about customs. So, and this is something that is very far away from the standards discussions about this credibility and the systems. This is fine, but the customs officials want just to know how to control the standards on the border. And this was one very practical issue that we need to have solved. So I think that this thinking a bit more about the interplay between regulation and standards is very important. And I know Karin knows that we have pushed ISEAL very much to hold this forum, to have a discussion on this interlink between policy and standards and regulation. So the dialogue and the mutual understanding of the challenges is extremely important to foster this integration of the standards.
Jeff, do you want to share any example, but then also maybe reflect on Axel's question about who do you think needs to make the first move towards alignment?
Sure, I'll speak to the alignment question. It's a great question, and I guess the first part of my answer is to say in the space of deforestation, we weren't sure who could do that, so we created our whole initiative to do it, which became the Accountability Framework Initiative. I think creating global alignment around these complex issues is often an ambiguous space. So I think there's two parts of that. One is kind of who should convene the process to figure out what that alignment could look like. And the second is who could ultimately kind of hold the instrument that codifies the alignment. And those can be considered separately. I think a lot of the people that could be conveners are here in this room. And you mentioned some of the work the Swiss government has done convening. And I think where this kind of alignment can be codified is, places like, the OECD guidelines or other international voluntary meta standards like ours, the Accountability Framework. I think kind of thinking to the future, there are some issues on our radar that we would see as really critical points for alignment, and it might be interesting for this group to also think about where are the potential places we might falter due to a lack of alignment. I think one of them that we've seen really prominently in the discourse around EUDR is the need for strong alignment between demand-side specifications and local governance at the national and at the subnational level. That's a broad theme. Another one that comes up for us is the role of product segregation versus the flexibility to use mass balance or crediting schemes when it comes to managing the attributes of products, especially where full segregation is likely to be quite expensive or require major changes to supply chain logistics. So I think that's kind of another frontier issue where alignment, bringing in perspectives from broad stakeholders, and also some of the major growth markets like China would be really crucial.
Christine, do you want to weigh in?
I would like to also link the two questions on essentially what the question is about, I think, is safe harbors and recognition, right? And I would like to speak against that. Not so much, I mean, given that we are operating a standard, that's probably not quite an opportune move. But I've been myself doing research, and I know the example of the Renewable Energy Directive and the biofuels, biomaterials sector, where this has, in my opinion, not been very productive, the recognition sub-schemes there, because, I mean, and we see this now with the omnibus debate, regulation is usually not the most ambitious level of ambition that you can have, right? This is usually the least common denominator that you can find. And so if you formally recognize VSS under regulation that is in some cases suboptimal, I think what you do is drive or create a race to the bottom dynamic unless you have really robust ways of recognizing at least credibility and improvement. So this is my case against safe harbor. I think and coming to the question is really rather about alignment and consistency that all actors need to engage in. And I would also second Jeff's points and maybe add, I think I would separate out two things. I think the one is alignment on content. And there, I mean, at least in the garments and also the minerals sector, we have OECD and the UNGPs playing a big role. OECD, especially with the alignment assessment, which we, by the way, have also undergone with the green button. Quite a powerful tool, I think, to do that. And then when it comes to credibility and the assurance systems, I do see a role for governments. I said earlier, I am strongly in favor of the green claims debate, and I think there's more to be done in terms of auditing and certification and really creating a level playing field.
Last thoughts, maybe Solomon and then Javier, and then we need to close.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll touch on the framework and also support from EU. So if you come to Ghana, I don't know whether other producing countries have the same thing. You know, Ghana, specifically cocoa, is regulated by Cocoa Board. And so when it comes to collaboration, any interaction with EU, mostly it is by Cocoa Board. And so I know there was that kind of discussion between Cocoa Board and then also EU. But the issue is that whilst that discussion may go on, commercial partners rather put pressure on we, the producers, to comply. That is where the challenge is. So they were not sure as to who they should approach for data when it comes to complying. So it puts that pressure on we, the producers, that whether Cocoa Board is setting up, because Cocoa Board was setting up a national system, which, as I speak to you, we have started the implementation of that. Alongside, we also have our system that we are also using. So we are doing double thing for achieving the same thing. So that is where the producers always will come out and say, we need support, because we are doing something that commercial partners feel comfortable dealing with that directly instead of going through Google. That is where the challenge is for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Last thoughts. We have 30 seconds. You said what you had.
I guess, in answer to Sergio's question, so these minimum sustainable criteria, I mean, they should be set by, in accordance to the preferences of countries, right? I mean, again, I talked about this tiered approach, and so, countries, if, again, based on their compliance, they should start low and then sort of upgrade as they build compliance. But again, following the preferences of the population, because then, that also can unleash, foreign capital and so on, right? As they, so there are incentives there, but of course, it should be driven by consumers. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all our 5 speakers and panelists. I'm sure you all will agree with me. We've given everyone plenty to chew over and think over for the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to end on the note of saying alignment. If we can take that word into the rest of the day and talk about what it means to us and what we need to achieve it. So on that note, thank you all very, very much. And I'm handing now back over to Emma before we go into lunch. Thank you.